The Progressive Era, an attempt by the American people to curb the industrialization brought on by big business and monopolies. Cheap labor and long hours were the order of the day. Workers' needs and health came second, while the profit margin was prioritized. Since America was founded as a nation, the skilled and unskilled laborers made the backbone of the country. From farmers to jewelers, the middle class provided the skilled workforce necessary to produce the advanced machines and goods that everyday citizens required.
As the nation progressed and the demands for goods rose, large-scale businesses began to develop. These large-scale operations began producing goods at an exponential rate, and as businesses began to grow, so did the profits and costs. As workers' conditions in these factories and mills continued to get worse, the greed of factory owners and the monopoly tycoons continued to grow. Due to a constant flow of immigrants from around the world, jobs were in constant demand, so any worker who attempted to take a stand would be immediately fired and a replacement hired from the seemingly endless pool of cheap labor.
This was not to last. In 1866, the National Labor Union formed, supported mainly by smaller construction unions and other skilled employees. It also campaigned for the unskilled laborers and farmers to join, but like many unions of the era, did not allow Chinese workers from the U.S. and made very few and poor attempts at defending the rights of female and black union members. Despite the drawbacks, the union peaked, boasting a whopping 700,000 members. The National Labor Union, though only lasting from 1866 to 1873, provided a route for other organizations to follow. It achieved early success in establishing the 8-hour workday for government workers. However, many government agencies reduced wages for the workers at the same time, despite a direct order from President Grant to not do so. These were also established in many states, such as California and New York, but loopholes in the statute made it mostly ineffective and unenforceable.
The NLU created its own demise when it adopted the policy of electoral politics, with emphasis that monetary reform was the only means of advancing its agenda. The organization failed at the polls and lost virtually all its supporters from smaller unions. The Depression of the 1870s dealt the final blow to the NLU, which collapsed and disbanded in 1873. Despite this failure, the NLU led the way for larger and more aggressive unions. The Pullman strike in 1877 is a prime example of how the NLU led the way for major strikes to begin against monopolies. The Pullman strike was a nationwide conflict in the summer of 1894 between the New American Railway Union and the railroads in the United States. It shut down much of the nation's freight and passenger traffic west of Detroit, Michigan. The conflict began in the town of Pullman, Illinois on May 11th when nearly 4,000 employees of the Pullman Palace Car Company began a wildcat strike in response to recent reductions in wages. Most factory workers who built Pullman cars lived in the planned worker community of Pullman. The industrialist George Pullman had designed it as a model community, but he controlled it thoroughly. When his company laid off workers and lowered wages, it did not reduce rents, and the workers called for a strike. They had not formed a union.
In order to organize the railroad workers, the American Railroad Association was founded by Eugene V. Debs in 1893 to organize the unskilled railroad workers. Debs brought in ARU organizers to Pullman and signed up many of the disgruntled workers. When the Pullman Company refused to arbitration, the ARU called for a strike against the Pullman factory, but it showed no signs of success. To eventually win the strike, Debs decided to stop the movement of Pullman cars on the railroads. The conductors and porters of the Pullman Company went on strike of most lines west of Detroit, which peaked around 250,000 workers in 27 states. The American Federation of Labor opposed the boycott, and the railroad brotherhoods opposed the strike. In total, riots and sabotage caused over $80 million in damages, and 30 people were killed. The U.S. government ordered Debs and the strikers to not interfere with trains carrying U.S. mail cars. After the strikers refused, President Grover Cleveland sent in military troops to stop strikers from obstructing the trains. Violence erupted in many cities, and the strike collapsed. Despite the failure of the strike, this showed how the labor unions could have a major impact on companies and the way they conducted business.
The labor movement was started on the notion that the worker was not simply a tool in the business, but an actual person who deserved to be treated as such. This ideology is what drove many of the actions of various unions. Several major labor strikes occurred in the early 1890s, the most prominent among them being the Homestead Strike, which protested against wage cuts at one of Andrew Carnegie's steel plants in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When Pittsburgh police refused to end the strike, Carnegie hired 300 private agents from the renowned Pinkerton Detective Agency to subdue the protest. The laborers, however, won a surprising victory after a bloody standoff. President Benjamin Harrison eventually sent troops to end the strike.
During these turbulent years for America's labor unions, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, quietly grew in power. Coordinating efforts for several dozen independent labor unions, Samuel Gompers founded the union in 1886, seeking better wages, working conditions, shorter working days, and the creation of an all-union workplace for its members. Unlike the National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor, the AFL represented only skilled white male craftsmen in the cities. Despite this limitation, the AFL survived the Gilded Age and would become one of the world's most powerful labor unions in the new century.
The labor movement was the culmination of an idea that the workman's well-being should be just as important as the monetary income and profit of the company. More importantly, it gave the workman a voice and the ability to fight for their rights. This led into a new age of labor, resulting in better working conditions, higher quality goods being produced, and much more honesty in the way business was conducted.